At 8:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, watching his invasion die. Through binoculars smeared with salt spray, he could see Omaha Beach, or what was left of it. Bodies floated in the surf, landing craft burned on the waterline. Soldiers who had made it to the sand lay motionless behind steel obstacles, pinned down by German machine gun fire that had not stopped since dawn. Bradley had told those men naval bombardment would obliterate the German defences before they even touched French soil. He had assured them they would face only demoralised second-rate troops. Now 2,000 of them were dead or dying, and the general commanding American ground forces was considering the unthinkable. Evacuation, pull the survivors off Omaha, redirect the follow-up waves to Utah Beach or to the British sector at Gold. Admit that the American assault had failed before it properly began. What Bradley did not know, could not know from his position 8 miles offshore, was that somewhere in that chaos, a 51-year-old general with a bad heart and a walking cane was about to change everything. The British had doubted the Americans from the beginning. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff and the professional head of the British Army, kept a diary throughout the war. In it, he recorded his private thoughts about strategy, about Churchill, and about the American allies whose entry into the war had saved Britain from almost certain defeat. Brooke respected American industrial power. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh were producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at rates the Germans could not match. But American soldiers were another matter. In Brooke's view, they lacked the combat experience that 2 years of fighting in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had given British troops. American generals, he believed, did not fully understand the German war machine they were about to face. This skepticism was not personal malice, it was institutional memory. The British had watched the French army collapse in 6 weeks during 1940. They had evacuated their own forces from Dunkirk with their backs to the sea. They had lost Singapore, Tobruk, and countless other positions to enemies who moved faster and fought harder than expected. Caution had become doctrine, and the Americans, with their optimism and their abundance and their soldiers who had never faced a Wehrmacht division in open battle, seemed dangerously naive. Prime Minister Winston Churchill shared these concerns. As late as February 1944, just 4 months before the invasion, he was still questioning the entire operation. "Why are we trying to do this?" he demanded in meetings. He proposed alternatives: Norway, the Mediterranean, the Balkans, anywhere but a direct assault on the most heavily fortified coastline in the world. The British preference was attrition, wear the Germans down through bombing, through peripheral campaigns, through letting the Soviets bleed the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. Only when German strength had been sufficiently reduced should the Allies risk a cross-channel invasion. The Americans disagreed. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, wanted concentration of force at the decisive point. Hit the enemy where it hurts most. End the war quickly. Stop the killing. This fundamental disagreement shaped every aspect of the invasion planning. The British wanted more time, more preparation, more certainty. The Americans wanted action. In the end, it was Stalin who broke the deadlock. At the Tehran Conference in November 1943, the Soviet leader joined Roosevelt in demanding a firm date for the invasion. Churchill, outnumbered, reluctantly agreed. May 1944, later pushed to June because of landing craft shortages. But even as the date approached, British doubts persisted. Would American troops perform under fire? Would American generals make sound decisions when plans collapsed? Would these young men from Iowa and Texas and California have the discipline and the courage to take a fortified beach against veteran German defenders? June 6th would provide the answer. The relationship between British and American forces in the months before D-Day was complicated by history and culture. British officers had been fighting since 1939. They had endured the fall of France, the Blitz, the disasters of Greece and Crete, the long grinding campaign in North Africa. They had lost friends, colleagues, entire divisions. They had learned hard lessons about German professionalism and German firepower. American officers, by contrast, had entered the war only in December 1941. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger until North Africa in late 1942. Even the veterans of Sicily and Italy were considered relatively green by British standards. This experience gap created friction. British officers sometimes treated their American counterparts as students who needed instruction. American officers sometimes resented British condescension. The alliance was real, but so were the tensions. Montgomery himself embodied these contradictions. He genuinely respected Eisenhower, the American general appointed as supreme commander of Allied forces. He also genuinely believed that he understood ground warfare better than Eisenhower ever would. In Montgomery's view, the Americans had potential, but they needed British guidance to realize it. Bradley, who commanded American ground forces under Montgomery during the invasion, felt the strain. "Montgomery left me with the feeling that I was a poor country cousin, whom he had to tolerate," Bradley later wrote. The comment reflected a real dynamic, one that would persist throughout the Normandy campaign. But there was another side to British attitudes. Montgomery toured American training camps in England during the spring of 1944. He spoke to American soldiers directly, without notes, connecting with them in ways that surprised his own staff. The troops responded warmly. They cheered when he arrived and cheered when he left. Whatever Montgomery thought of American generals, he recognized something in American soldiers. These were young men willing to fight. They had crossed an ocean to liberate a continent they had never seen. They believed in their cause with an intensity that sometimes made cynical British officers uncomfortable. The question was whether belief would be enough when the bullets started flying. The planning for Omaha Beach assumed many things that turned out to be wrong. Army intelligence believed the beach was defended by a single regiment of the German 716th Static Infantry Division. These were second-rate troops, older men and foreign conscripts deemed unfit for the Eastern Front. The planners expected light resistance. What they did not know was that the German 352nd Infantry Division had moved into the area in March. This was a different kind of unit entirely. Younger soldiers, veteran officers and non-commissioned officers transferred from the Eastern Front, better equipment, higher morale. The invasion plan also assumed that air and naval bombardment would devastate the German defenses before the first soldier touched sand. Heavy bombers would crater the beach, creating cover for advancing troops. Naval guns would destroy the concrete bunkers overlooking the waterline. Neither happened. Cloud cover on the morning of June 6th forced the heavy bombers to delay their release to avoid hitting Allied ships. In those brief seconds of delay, the aircraft traveled far enough that their bombs fell not on the beach, but on the empty fields beyond. The German positions were untouched. The naval bombardment lasted only 40 minutes. Rear Admiral John Hall had argued for hours of sustained fire, but his superiors overruled him. "It is a crime to send me on the biggest amphibious attack in history with such inadequate naval gunfire support," Hall said. He was right. And then there were the tanks. The plan called for 32 amphibious Sherman tanks to land with the first wave at Omaha, providing mobile artillery support as the infantry advanced. These were DD tanks, fitted with canvas flotation screens that allowed them to swim ashore from their landing craft. But the English Channel on June 6th was not cooperative. 5-foot swells and strong currents battered the fragile screens. In the eastern sector of Omaha, 29 tanks were launched. 27 sank before reaching the beach. Their crews drowned inside them. In the western sector, the tank commander wisely refused to launch, ordering his Shermans delivered directly onto the sand instead. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions arrived at Omaha without armor support, without effective air cover, and facing an enemy far stronger than anyone had told them to expect. The killing began immediately. Many soldiers died before they could exit their landing craft. German machine gunners had registered their weapons on the waterline. They knew exactly where the ramps would drop. When the steel doors swung open, bullets poured in. Men who survived the ramps jumped into water over their heads, weighted down with equipment. Some drowned within feet of the beach. Others struggled through the surf only to find no cover on the sand. The bombing craters that were supposed to shelter them did not exist. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, part of the 29th Division, landed directly in front of a German strongpoint. Within 10 minutes, the company had suffered 96% casualties. Of more than 200 men, fewer than 20 reached the seawall alive. The survivors who made it to the beach found themselves trapped. Behind them, the rising tide. Ahead, a gradual slope of sand leading to a seawall, then a band of marsh grass, then steep bluffs crowned with German bunkers. Every inch of that ground was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Men huddled behind steel obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. They pressed their bodies into the sand and prayed. Some were in shock, unable to move or respond to orders. Others were wounded, calling for medics who could not reach them. The official timeline called for American troops to be 1 mile inland by 8:30 in the morning. 6 hours after the landing began, they held only 10 yards of beach. Brigadier General Norman Cota landed at Omaha Beach at 7:30, 1 hour after the first wave. He was 51 years old, the Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, and one of the highest-ranking officers to go ashore that day. His landing craft took machine gun fire on the approach. 3 soldiers were killed exiting the boat. Cota had opposed the daylight landing from the beginning. At planning conferences, he had argued for a pre-dawn assault, believing that tactical surprise offered the best chance of success. His superiors disagreed. The naval and air bombardment would neutralize German defenses, they assured him. The defenders would be outnumbered, inexperienced, and demoralized. Cota's opposition was not mere pessimism. He had studied amphibious operations extensively. Before D-Day, he served as the American advisor to the Combined Operations Division in the European theater. He had helped train troops for beach landings. He understood what could go wrong. At the Conference on Landing Assaults in 1943, Cota had made his case directly. Tactical surprise is one of the most powerful factors in determining success, he told the assembled officers. I favor the night landing. I do not believe the daylight assault can succeed. Other senior officers shared his concerns. Major General Leonard Gero, commander of 5th Corps, argued for the same approach. So did Admiral John Hall, who commanded the naval forces delivering troops to Omaha. All 3 men were overruled by higher command. The decision-makers believed that naval and air bombardment would compensate for the loss of surprise. They were wrong, and Cota knew they would be wrong, but once the decision was made, he prepared his men for the reality they would face. On the afternoon before the invasion, he had gathered his staff and given them a different kind of briefing. This is different from any of the exercises you have had so far, he told them. The landing craft are not going in on schedule and people are going to be landed in the wrong place. Some will not be landed at all. We must improvise, carry on, not lose our heads. Now, standing on a beach littered with the dead and dying, Cota improvised. He walked upright. While other men crawled or hugged the ground, Cota strode across the beach as if German bullets could not touch him. He moved from group to group, rallying shocked soldiers, kicking men into motion, pointing toward the bluffs and shouting orders. At one point, he encountered soldiers from the 5th Ranger Battalion pinned down near the seawall. He asked the commander what unit they were. 5th Rangers, someone shouted back. Cota's response became legend. Well, God damn it then, Rangers, lead the way. That phrase would become the official motto of the United States Army Rangers. But on June 6, 1944, it was simply a general demanding that his men stop dying on the beach and start killing Germans. The Rangers at Omaha that day were elite troops, volunteers who had undergone brutal training for special operations. They had originally been assigned to assault Point du Hoc, a cliff overlooking the beach where German artillery supposedly threatened the entire invasion. Some Rangers had scaled those cliffs in one of the most daring actions of the day. But other Ranger units, including elements of the 2nd and 5th Battalions, had been redirected to Omaha when communications broke down. They landed expecting to link up with comrades at Point du Hoc and instead found themselves in the same killing zone as the infantry. The Rangers were better trained than most of the soldiers on the beach. They were in better physical condition. They had practiced assaulting fortified positions. But none of that mattered when you were pinned down behind a seawall with machine gun fire inches above your head. What Cota offered was something training could not provide: leadership by example. A man willing to walk where others would not walk, to expose himself to fire that others avoided. The Rangers followed him not because of his rank, but because of what he did. A soldier nearby had a Bangalore torpedo, a long tube filled with explosives designed to blow gaps in wire obstacles. Kota ordered him to use it on the wire blocking the path up the bluff. The explosion opened a breach. The first man through was shot dead by a sniper. The soldiers behind him froze. Kota did not freeze. He walked into the breach himself, through the gap in the wire, and started climbing. When he looked back, men were following him. Not many at first, then more. Within hours, small groups of soldiers were pushing inland at multiple points along Omaha Beach. They did not follow the invasion plan because the invasion plan was dead. They followed sergeants and lieutenants and privates who decided that moving forward was better than dying in place. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment summarized the situation with brutal clarity. "There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach," he told his men. "Those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let us get the hell out of here." By late afternoon, the beach was no longer a killing field. It was a beachhead, narrow, fragile, purchased at terrible cost, but real. The Navy had saved them. When Bradley was contemplating evacuation, Rear Admiral Alan Kirk asked if the Navy could help break the stalemate. The answer was yes. Destroyers that had pulled back after the initial bombardment returned to the beachfront, closing to within 800 yards of the shore. This was dangerously close. The water was shallow. The destroyers risked running aground. They did not care. Rear Admiral Carlton Bryant radioed a general message from the battleship USS Texas. "Get on them, men, get on them. They are raising hell with the men on the beach and we cannot have any more of that. We must stop it." The destroyer captains responded with everything they had. They poured fire into German positions on the bluffs, targeting bunkers and machine gun nests that the aerial bombardment had missed. Some ships fired until their guns overheated. Others expended their entire ammunition supply. Colonel Stanhope Mason, Chief of Staff of the 1st Infantry Division, later credited the Navy with making survival possible. "I am firmly convinced that our supporting naval fire got us in," he said. "Without the gunfire, we positively could not have crossed the beaches." But gunfire alone did not clear Omaha. Men did. Men like Kota and Taylor and hundreds of unnamed sergeants and privates who decided to move. At Utah Beach, 15 miles to the west, a different kind of American leadership was on display. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was 56 years old, the oldest man to storm the beaches on D-Day, and the only general officer to land with the first wave of troops. He walked with a cane because of arthritis from wounds suffered in the First World War. He had a heart condition that he had hidden from Army doctors because he knew they would never clear him for combat. Roosevelt had requested permission to land with the assault troops 3 times. Twice his commanding officer refused. The third request, submitted in writing, was finally approved. Major General Raymond Barton, commander of the 4th Infantry Division, signed the paperwork fully expecting that Roosevelt would die on the beach. Roosevelt's written request explained his reasoning. "The force and skill with which the first elements hit the beach and proceed may determine the ultimate success of the operation," he wrote. "I believe I can contribute materially by going in with the assault companies. Furthermore, I personally know both officers and men of these advance units and believe that it will steady them to know that I am with them." This was not bravado. Roosevelt understood that soldiers fight better when they know their commander is sharing their danger. He had learned that lesson in the First World War when he led troops through some of the worst fighting on the Western Front. He had been gassed and shot. He had won decorations for valor. He knew what combat demanded. Between the wars, Roosevelt had pursued a political career. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Harding. He was Governor of Puerto Rico and later Governor General of the Philippines. He ran for Governor of New York and lost. When the Second World War began, he was in his 50s and suffering from health problems that would have excused him from service. He did not want to be excused. He returned to active duty and pushed for combat assignments despite his age and his ailments. He saw action in North Africa and Sicily before being assigned to the 4th Infantry Division for the invasion. The 4th Division was a different kind of unit than the 29th at Omaha. It was a regular army division, professionally staffed and intensively trained, but it too was facing its first major amphibious assault against prepared defenses. Roosevelt believed his presence would make a difference. He was right. He did not die. He landed in the wrong place. Strong currents pushed the first wave of landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended target. Roosevelt came ashore, looked around, and made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. "We will start the war from right here," he announced. Instead of trying to move his troops to the original landing zone under fire, Roosevelt ordered them to advance inland from where they actually were. He personally reconnoitered the area, walking through German fire to identify routes off the beach. He stood at the water's edge as subsequent waves arrived, directing each unit to its new objective. His son, Captain Quentin Roosevelt II, landed that same morning at Omaha Beach. They were the only father and son to both come ashore on D-Day. Years later, General Omar Bradley was asked to name the single most heroic action he had ever witnessed in combat. He answered without hesitation: Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach. Roosevelt received the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 6th. He died of a heart attack 5 weeks later, still in Normandy, still with his men. He never learned of the decoration. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces on D-Day. He was the most famous British general of the war, the hero of El Alamein, the man who had finally defeated Rommel in North Africa. Montgomery had overseen the final planning for Operation Overlord. He had expanded the invasion from 3 divisions to 5, insisting that the original plan was too narrow. He had visited American units in England during the months before the invasion, speaking to troops, building their confidence, and his popularity among American soldiers was genuine. But Montgomery was also watching June 6th with particular attention. The British beaches, Golden Sword, were his primary concern. The Canadian landing at Juneau fell under his command as well. American performance at Omaha and Utah mattered to him because failure there would expose his own flank. The news from Omaha during the morning hours was alarming. Montgomery knew that Bradley was considering evacuation. He also knew that pulling American troops off one beach and redirecting them to another would create chaos that could doom the entire invasion. Montgomery had an alternative in mind. If Omaha failed completely, he considered the possibility of diverting American Fifth Corps through Gold Beach, filtering them through the British sector to maintain the advance. But that option assumed British success. And on the British beaches, success was not yet certain. Gold Beach was assigned to the British 50th Division, the Northumbrians. These were veterans of North Africa and Sicily, experienced soldiers who knew what German fire sounded like. Their landing went better than Omaha, but not without cost. German artillery and mortar fire struck the assault waves hard. Several villages had to be cleared house by house. At Sword Beach, the British 3rd Infantry Division landed with the objective of capturing Caen, the largest city in the invasion zone. Caen was supposed to fall on D-Day. It would not fall for another month. German armour, specifically the 21st Panzer Division, launched a counterattack in the afternoon that threatened to split the British beachhead. Only the arrival of glider reinforcements turned the tide. Montgomery's plan to take Caen quickly had failed. His optimistic timeline was already in ruins by nightfall on June 6th, but the beachhead held, and on Omaha, against all expectations, the Americans had held too. The contrast between British and American performance on D-Day was not a simple story of one nation succeeding and another failing. Both armies faced determined German opposition. Both armies took heavy casualties. Both armies achieved their minimum objectives while falling short of their optimistic goals. But the character of the fighting differed. British operations were methodical. The 50th Division at Gold Beach advanced according to doctrine, using combined arms tactics developed over years of combat experience. Infantry worked with tanks. Artillery supported infantry. Air cover suppressed German positions. The advance was steady if not spectacular. American operations were chaotic. At Omaha, doctrine collapsed within minutes of the first landing. Units that were supposed to assault specific objectives never reached their designated beaches. Officers who were supposed to lead companies died in the surf. The chain of command fragmented. What replaced doctrine was something more primal: individual initiative, small group leadership, a willingness to improvise that British observers found both alarming and impressive. British Army training emphasized following orders. The plan was the plan. You executed it. American training, particularly among the citizen soldiers of the National Guard and the draftee divisions, was less rigid. When the plan failed, Americans were more likely to make a new one on the spot. This was not always an advantage. Sometimes it led to confusion and wasted effort. But on Omaha Beach, where the plan was dead before it started, it proved essential. The British command watched what happened at Omaha Beach with a mixture of horror and growing respect. The 29th Infantry Division that landed at Omaha was a National Guard unit, formed from the militias of Maryland and Virginia. Many of its soldiers had never seen combat. By British standards, they were green troops, exactly the kind of inexperienced Americans that Brooke and others had worried about. The division carried history with it. Its nickname was the Blue and Gray, reflecting its origins in states that had fought on opposite sides of the American Civil War. Men from Baltimore served alongside men from Richmond. The division's symbol, a blue and grey yin-yang design, proclaimed that old enemies could become comrades. These were not professional soldiers in the European sense. They were clerks and farmers and factory workers who had joined the National Guard for extra money or family tradition or simple patriotism. They had trained together for years, first as weekend warriors, then as full-time soldiers preparing for a war they knew was coming. Their training had been extensive but not combat-tested. They had practiced amphibious landings at Slapton Sands in England, a beach chosen because it resembled Omaha. They had rehearsed the assault plan dozens of times. They knew their objectives, their routes, their timing. None of it prepared them for what they found on June 6th. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, was different. These were veterans of North Africa and Sicily. They had fought Germans before. They knew what incoming fire sounded like. They knew what it felt like to watch friends die. The 1st Division landed alongside the 29th at Omaha. The plan assumed their experience would stiffen the National Guardsmen, that veteran leadership would compensate for green troops. In practice, veterans died just as fast as newcomers. The German machine gunners did not check military records before pulling their triggers. Yet these green troops had done something remarkable. Under fire that would have broken veteran units, with their armour at the bottom of the English Channel, with their officers dead and their plans in shreds, they had attacked. Not as a coordinated force executing a brilliant strategy, but as small groups of desperate men who refused to die lying down. What struck British observers most was the sheer stubbornness of the American assault, a refusal to accept defeat even when defeat was the logical outcome, an almost irrational determination to keep fighting when any sensible army would have retreated. It was not elegant, it was not by the book, but it worked. Montgomery himself pinned the British Distinguished Service Order on General Cotter after the invasion. The DSO was one of Britain's highest awards for gallantry, rarely given to foreign officers. The citation recognized Cotter's leadership under intense fire, his role in rallying troops and his personal courage in leading men off the beach. This was not a routine decoration. This was the British military establishment acknowledging that an American general had performed with exceptional valor, that he had saved a critical moment in the invasion through pure force of will. Other British awards followed. American officers and enlisted men received decorations from the British government for actions on D-Day. These awards were not paperwork exercises. They represented genuine recognition from an ally that had entered the war skeptical of American capabilities and emerged from June 6th with new respect. The German perspective confirmed what the British observed. Defenders on Omaha Beach reported astonishment at American persistence. German soldiers in the bunkers watched wave after wave of landing craft deposit troops on the beach. They watched Americans walk into murderous fire, watched them fall, and then watched more come behind them. The attack made no tactical sense to the defenders. Yet the Americans kept coming. The defenders at Omaha had prepared thoroughly. German engineers had planted thousands of obstacles in the tidal zone. Steel hedgehogs designed to rip open landing craft, wooden poles topped with mines, concrete barriers, iron gates. The beach was a maze of death traps, Above the waterline, the Germans had constructed bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun positions covered every approach. Mortar teams had registered their weapons on the most likely landing points. Artillery batteries stood ready to destroy anything that survived the initial assault. The soldiers manning these positions knew their jobs. Many had transferred from the Eastern Front, where they had fought the Red Army in conditions even more brutal than Normandy. They understood defensive warfare. They understood how to kill men who were trying to kill them. Heinrich Severloh was one of those soldiers, a machine gunner with the 352nd Infantry Division. He was stationed at a position called Weiderstandsnest 62, overlooking the Easy Red sector of Omaha Beach. On the morning of June 6th, he began firing at American soldiers wading through the surf. Severloh later claimed to have fired over 13,000 rounds that day, though historians view this figure with skepticism. What is certain is that he watched Americans fall by the dozens. He watched landing craft burn. He watched the attack falter and believed for hours that the defense would hold. The fire from positions like Severloh's was devastating. Every report reaching the Augusta painted the same picture. American forces were pinned down. Casualties were catastrophic. The beachhead was not forming. But the German defenders had a problem they did not fully appreciate. They were running out of ammunition faster than the Americans were running out of men. German commanders had expected that sufficient casualties would break the American assault. This was standard military logic. Every army has a breaking point, a level of loss beyond which soldiers will no longer advance. The German defenders at Omaha inflicted casualties that should have reached that point within the first hour. The breaking point never came. Individual Americans broke. Units disintegrated. Men froze or fled or died where they stood. But others took their places. The attack continued. Not because of superior strategy or firepower, but because enough Americans refused to stop. This refusal had consequences that extended beyond the tactical situation. German morale, already strained by years of fighting on multiple fronts, suffered a blow at Omaha that pure casualty figures cannot capture. The German soldiers at Omaha were good troops. They were well positioned, well armed, and well led. They inflicted casualties that should have won the battle. And they lost anyway. The psychological impact of that loss rippled through German ranks in Normandy. If Omaha could not be held, what could? If American soldiers could take those beaches after suffering those losses, what would stop them? The answer, German commanders increasingly realized, was nothing. Time might slow the Americans, terrain might delay them, but stopping them entirely seemed impossible. They had too many men, too many tanks, too much ammunition, and they had something else, a willingness to absorb punishment that defied German expectations. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had warned about this before the invasion. Rommel understood American industrial capacity. He knew that once the Allies established a beachhead, German defeat was only a matter of time. The battle would be decided on the beaches, he told his officers. If the Allies got ashore, Germany would lose the war. The Allies got ashore. Germany lost the war. By evening on June 6, the German 352nd Division had lost 20% of its strength. It had no reserves. The positions that had seemed impregnable at dawn were falling one by one to Americans who should have been dead. The implications of D-Day extended far beyond the beaches. For the British, June 6th forced a recalibration. American soldiers could fight. American generals could lead. The skepticism that had shaped British strategic thinking for 2 years was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. The Americans were different from the British. They were more aggressive, less cautious, more willing to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives. Whether this was wisdom or foolishness depended on the situation. At Omaha, it had been salvation. Field Marshal Brooke continued to criticize American tactics in his diary throughout the Normandy campaign. He thought they attacked along too broad a front, that they lacked the precision of British operations, that their logistics were wasteful. Some of these criticisms were valid, but Brooke also recorded respect. The Americans learned quickly. They adapted to the hedgerow, fighting that bogged down both armies in the weeks after D-Day. They developed new tactics, new equipment, new approaches. They did not repeat the same mistakes indefinitely. And they won. The lessons of D-Day transformed the Allied alliance. Before June 6, the British had approached American forces as junior partners who needed supervision. After June 6, that attitude came harder to sustain. The Americans had proven themselves in the most demanding test imaginable. They had taken a fortified beach against veteran defenders with inadequate support and impossible odds. They had done it through raw courage and stubborn determination. This did not mean British criticisms disappeared. Montgomery continued to clash with American generals throughout the campaign. Brooke continued to record his doubts in his diary. The fundamental differences in military philosophy remained, but the nature of the criticism changed. Before D-Day, British officers questioned whether Americans could fight effectively. After D-Day, they questioned American methods while acknowledging American results. The Americans might not do things the British way, but they got things done. This shift had strategic implications. As the war progressed, American forces grew while British forces shrank. By 1945, the majority of Allied troops in Western Europe were American. The balance of the alliance tilted decisively toward Washington. British generals adjusted. They had to. The Americans were no longer students learning from experienced teachers. They were equals, sometimes superiors, partners in an enterprise that neither nation could have completed alone. The mutual respect forged on June 6 outlasted the war. British and American officers who had fought together in Normandy maintained relationships for decades afterward. They attended reunions together. They wrote memoirs that acknowledged each other's contributions. They understood something that civilians sometimes forgot. They had shared an experience that bound them together regardless of nationality. By August 1944, American forces had broken out of Normandy in Operation Cobra. By September, they had liberated Paris. By the following spring, they were crossing the Rhine into Germany itself. The British contributed enormously to this victory. British intelligence had cracked German codes and provided crucial information about enemy positions. British deception operations had convinced Hitler that the main invasion would come at Calais, keeping German reserves away from Normandy. British troops had drawn German armour onto their sector, allowing the American breakout. But the alliance that won the war was forged in fire on June 6th. It was forged by men like Cotter and Roosevelt and the anonymous soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions, who refused to accept that Omaha Beach could not be taken. The British watched those men and understood that the war had changed. General Norman Cotter survived Normandy. He took command of the 28th Infantry Division in August 1944 and led it through the Battle of the Bulge. He retired from the army in 1946 as a major general. In the years after the war, Cotter rarely spoke about D-Day. When asked, he deflected praise to the men who served alongside him, but the men who served with him remembered. They remembered the general walking upright through machine gun fire. They remembered his voice cutting through the chaos. They remembered following him into the breach, because following him seemed less terrifying than staying behind. Cotter died in 1971 in Wichita, Kansas. His obituary mentioned his military service, but not the details. It did not mention that he had created the Ranger motto. It did not mention that Montgomery had personally decorated him. It did not mention that he had walked onto a beach where 2,000 men died and walked off that beach with a beachhead. Those who served with Cotter remembered differently. They told stories about the general who walked upright when everyone else was crawling. They told their children and their grandchildren. They made sure that someone knew what happened on Dog White sector of Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. An effort has been underway for years to upgrade Cotter's Distinguished Service Cross to the Medal of Honor. As of this recording, that effort has not succeeded. The paperwork moves slowly through bureaucratic channels. The witnesses are dead. The evidence is scattered. The men who fought at Omaha deserve more than medals. They deserve to be remembered for what they actually did, not as abstract heroes but as specific individuals who faced specific horrors and chose to fight anyway. That sentiment echoed across Normandy on June 6th. Men who performed extraordinary acts of courage did not think of themselves as extraordinary. They thought of themselves as soldiers doing what soldiers do. The beach had to be taken. They took it. The outcome of June 6th is not scattered. It is carved in stone at the Normandy American Cemetery above Omaha Beach. 9,389 graves, row after row of white crosses and stars of David marking the final resting place of men who died, taking a beach that could not be taken. The British generals who watched those men land had doubted them. They had worried about American inexperience, about American overconfidence, about American lack of respect for the German enemy. They were not wrong to worry. Many of the things they feared came true. American units did break under fire. American plans did fail. American soldiers did die in numbers that shocked even hardened veterans. But the British generals also watched something they had not expected. They watched Americans who should have quit keep fighting. They watched green troops become veterans in a single morning. They watched an army that had never faced the Wehrmacht prove that it could take casualties and keep attacking, and they watched that army win. What the British said about American troops after D-Day was not uniform. Some remained critical, some converted completely, most fell somewhere in the middle, acknowledging American courage while maintaining reservations about American methods. But none of them could deny what had happened on Omaha Beach. None of them could deny that the invasion had succeeded where it might have failed, that the beachhead had held when logic said it should not have held, that Americans had done something that morning that deserved respect. Montgomery gave Cotter the Distinguished Service Order. Brooke recorded American success in his diary alongside his criticisms. Churchill praised the Americans in his speeches to Parliament and meant what he said. The alliance between Britain and America was never perfect. The two nations fought together, but not always smoothly. They disagreed on strategy, on tactics, on priorities. They competed for glory and resources and credit. But on June 6, 1944, they shared a beach. And on that beach, under fire that killed thousands, they proved that their alliance could win the war. The British doubted the Americans. Then they watched the Americans fight. And after that, whatever doubts remained were tempered by something stronger. Respect. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was buried in Normandy. His grave at the American Cemetery overlooks Omaha Beach, not far from the position where his son came ashore on the same day he landed at Utah. The two are among the few father and son pairs to have fought together on D-Day. Roosevelt's Medal of Honor citation describes his actions in formal military language. It speaks of repeated leadership under fire, of personal reconnaissance through enemy positions, of disregard for his own safety. What it cannot capture is the image of a 56-year-old general with a cane walking calmly through German artillery. Fire pointing directions to terrified young soldiers, telling them that starting the war from the wrong place did not mean they could not win it. Omar Bradley, the general who had nearly evacuated Omaha Beach, went on to command the 12th Army Group, the largest American field command in history. By the end of the war, he led more than 1.3 million soldiers. He became a 5-star general of the army, one of only 5 men to hold that specific rank. Bradley never forgot what he witnessed on June 6th. In his memoirs and his interviews, he returned repeatedly to Omaha Beach. Every man who set foot on Omaha Beach that day was a hero, he wrote. The statement was not false modesty. Bradley had seen what those men did. He knew what it cost. Montgomery returned to England after the war as a national hero. He served as chief of the Imperial General Staff and later as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. His reputation fluctuated over the decades as historians debated his decisions in Normandy, but his role in planning and executing D-Day remained central to his legacy. The alliance between Britain and America that was tested on June 6th continued long after the guns fell silent. NATO bound the two nations together through the Cold War and beyond. The cooperation forged in 1944 became the foundation of Western security for generations. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who cares about history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories from the Second World War. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and we are honored to have you here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.